Welcome to the Brave Feminine Leadership podcast, where I get the chance to connect and interview global leaders, and we get to soak up their wisdom and perspective on all things life and leadership. And today I am absolutely thrilled to welcome Tami Erwin to the conversation. Tami, thank you for joining me.
It's an honor and a privilege. Thank you, Melissa, for engaging in the conversation.
So let me share with our audience, Tami, for those that haven't had the pleasure of coming across you before, let me just share briefly your bio. So Tami Erwin is a veteran CEO and Fortune 500 director. She's a daughter, sister, wife, mum, favourite auntie, friend, and experienced executive who is committed to leaving the world a better place through the use of technology to enhance how we all live, work, and play. Over a 35-year career that took her from customer service rep to CEO of Verizon, a $35 billion business leading over 75,000 employees. Tami's known as a player's coach and a people-first leader, and today she is a board director for John Deere, F5, Xerox, York Space Systems, and Skylo Technologies. Tami was named one of Fortune's most powerful women in 2020 and 2021. Tami, who are you as a human being?
Yeah, thank you for the very generous bio and review. I think we as individuals can define ourselves so many ways, and yet I like to anchor first and foremost who I'm in the business of people. When we think about people, I think about customers, I think about employees, I think about shareholders, I think about partners, I think about our communities in which we live, work, and play. And for me, really understanding how the work that we do, whether it's volunteer work, paid work, being part of the community and really impacting the world in a positive way is super important to me. One of the things that, Melissa, I have worked hard to do, both at my time at Verizon as well as I built this board portfolio, is to be really intentional about the work that I do. Am I working with people that I respect? Do the people that I'm working with share a common set of values? Integrity, respect, accountability, understanding that the world is not just for profit. I'm okay with profit, but let's make sure we bring everybody along. How do we also make sure that the missions that we're driving are missions that are going to help not just a rich community, but the entire world? And I start with technology really there because I had the chance to grow up as wireless was becoming a thing. My very first exposure to a cellular phone was almost 40 years ago, and it was one of the big brick phones. And I remember my very first call. I was calling home to my husband as I was leaving work, and I put that phone up to my ear. I was driving a stick shift going up a hill, so not great conditions. And as I was driving, I hit the send key and he answered, and it was scratchy and I could hardly hear him, but wow, was it cool.
Yeah.
And my 40 years have given me a chance to really see technology transform how we think about our lives and where and how we spend our time. And I think so much good has come from it. I think there's also things that we really need to be considerate about in a world where we're always connected. And so I'm a people first person. I love technology. I love the ability to understand how do we change. I think we live in incredibly exciting times. There's never been a better time to be alive, and yet we face some real daunting challenges that require leadership for us to move forward as a globe.
Tami, I remember you reminded me of a story when I'd not long left school, and I remember a close friend of mine, her parents called us for the first time from the car on their car phone. And you don't forget moments like that, do you?
Right.
You know,
No, you really don't. They're kind of burnt into your mind as those moments. In fact, I remember my oldest, who is now 36 and a very accomplished adult. She said to me when she was about 4 or 5, we were driving in a car home one day, and she said, "We should call Auntie Susie, my sister." And I said, "Well, she doesn't have a phone." And she said, "That's so sad she wouldn't have a phone." So those moments have long gone, but those indelible moments where you think about really how technology is changing the way we engage with society.
yeah. So, Tami, you have and continue to have an extraordinary career. And I really want to get into your career story. Starting from a customer service rep, we have a common background, starting from the same place. So, Why Verizon? How did that come about? Was your goal what was your goal when you sort of left school and, take us back through that journey.
Yeah, it's interesting as you reflect back on what you've learned in life and how you continue to. I think we're all curious students of life every day and continue to be. But I reflect back and say, I'd love to say I had a plan and it was all mapped out, but that's really not how life works. My husband, I married my childhood sweetheart. We dated in high school, got married in college, and I really felt like he was going to have the lead career in our family. He was an accomplished certified accountant, and he was going to lead, and I would do something and ultimately stay home and have kids in the very traditional path of being a mom, which, by the way, is a beautiful path for anybody who chooses that path. And that was really my intent. I'd grown up in a home where my father was a physician, my mother a nurse, and my father really led with his career. So that was my intention. And as we had finished up and really tried to anticipate what our future looked like pre-kids, I was introduced to a company that was a cellular business. I didn't even know what it was at the time, but a recruiter introduced me to the business and said, there's this customer service rep, kind of customer service rep, a little bit admin. They're interested in talking to you. Are you willing to have the conversation? I'm like, of course. And I will never forget meeting the woman who I worked for, my first chance to work for a woman. And I was so excited about the mission of what she was doing. And I thought, I'll do this for a couple of years. And when I grow up, I'll figure out what I want to do. And I'm not sure I've fully grown up and I'm not sure I've fully figured out what I want to do, but I've had a chance to do so many incredible jobs over the years. And US West at the time was the result of the breakup of the Bell operating companies here in the US. And ultimately, we came to post kind of mergers and consolidations, what we now know as Verizon. I've had a lot of different coffee mugs with a lot of different brands and names on them, but I had a chance to really experience the business through the eyes of a customer. And I think that's one of the things, Melissa, as you indicated, we share in common is when you have a chance to serve the customer, you understand very clearly that your outcome is anticipated as making the customer a loyalist and a believer for life, particularly in a subscription-based business. But the other really valuable lesson I learned is that I believe most people in the service industry want to be successful. They want to do a good job for the customer, but it is our job as leaders to make sure that our employees have the tools, the resources, and the information to be successful. And that lesson really has carried through for me throughout my career is that the responsibility of a leader is to make sure their teams can be successful. It's not to be the boss, it's to create a vision and a strategy and a direction, and then create the environment where everybody belongs and they can rally to be successful on behalf of the common goal and mission. And for me, I think that's what I took out of that very first job was when you work hard, when you understand that you're trying to solve a problem, when you don't have a job description, anything you need to do is yours to do, you figure out pretty quickly that you can get a lot done in a very short period of time. And then I had the opportunity to live through, and I'm sure we'll talk about it, kind of the progression of my career over that 35-year period of time.
So clearly the 3-year point came and went and you decided to stay. At what point, tell us about that journey in terms of some of the experiences you gathered along the way. What kept you there? What kept you engaged? How did some of these promotion opportunities come about along the way for you as well?
Yeah, I would tell you that I had promotional opportunities, I had lateral opportunities, I had the opportunity to pick up and move. And if I kind of fast forward through my career, my first couple of years I spent in customer service. I also had my first child. My husband was busy in his career of public accounting, and I was doing my work in the cellular business. And all of a sudden, we had children, and that was part of what we had planned in our lives. And my boss at the time was so incredibly supportive of me having the opportunity opportunity to be a mom and also continue to work and do the work I was doing. Although I look back on it and I think I had 4 weeks of leave and 2 weeks maybe because I had a C-section. So that was an extended leave. And then we had our second child, and my husband had moved from public accounting he was a partner at a building business. And about 5 years into my career, I started to have the conversations about career progression. And I remember the very first long-term compensation grant I was given. And it was one of those grants that I was given because of performance and potential. And I remember my boss's boss coming to me and delivering this grant. It was one of the PSUs that are oftentimes used for retention. And I had no idea what it was. I didn't even understand kind of why that was happening. But all of a sudden it went from I was doing this job that I loved working with people I loved to now I had potential and I had the opportunity to make bigger money than I had anticipated. And I should just back up for one quick second. My very first job in my life was picking strawberries. I grew up north of Seattle, Washington, and I was in the ag community, and I learned that the more you picked, the more you got paid. But so there was this competitive spirit that I had clearly learned early in my life. And I began to realize that I could continue to move in different roles in the organization and have more responsibility and continue to move the business forward. And I loved the engagement with people. And so we now have 2 kids, and I've moved into from a supervisor to a manager to a director to a VP role. And I'll never forget, I had a boss who said to me, "You will never be a director until you're 30 years of age." And I'm like, what does age have to do with the
Absolutely.
ability to move into a director role? And then I had somebody new who became my boss, and he was somebody who said, "I'm going to give you some really good feedback about the things that you're great at and the things that I'd like to see you do more of, because I believe you have tremendous potential." And I look back on some of those meaningful conversations, somebody who said I had to be 30, but somebody else who said, "I see great potential. I see the opportunity for you to do great things. Here's feedback that you should have." And one of those pieces of feedback is something that I've kept with me forever. He said, "Not everybody likes to work with you because you're so competitive." And I said, "Competitive? I don't view myself as competitive at all." And he said, "When we're solving a problem, you're the first one who has the answer, and it's your way or the highway." And what I didn't realize at the time, and I've since learned as I've kind of managed throughout my career, is you have to manage both your impact as well as your intention. And my intention was, there's a problem, let's figure out what we need to do and get after it. And his point was, "Tami, you need to step back and be able to bring people along on the journey of solving that problem. And what if you came behind and you kind of summarized what other people had as ideas and moved people forward after everybody had a chance to talk about what they thought was possible?" And I reflect back on that. It was some of the best feedback I ever had, because I think so often in our roles in life, we have an intention, and our intentions can be very, very good. Our impact on others can be very disruptive in a work environment. And I've oftentimes used that to coach and develop teams. I then went on and I had we as a family had our first opportunity to move and to do a corporate move. And we had the opportunity to move from Seattle to Arizona or Colorado. And because I now live in Colorado and we call it home, I'll tell you a quick story. Our daughter was just going into middle school. Our son was in elementary school, and we had promised our daughter living in Seattle that we would take her down to San Diego for spring break. Well, what, middle schooler doesn't want to go to spring break, get away from the rain. And then we had this opportunity that said, "Hey, we'd like you to move. We'd like you to take on a region president job, which is a P&L job, moving out of customer service into a P&L job. And you can live in Colorado or Arizona." And so we said to our daughter, Jacqueline, "We're going to do a different vacation. We're going to go check out Colorado." And she was so irritable with us. Like, "How would you disrupt my spring break to go to Colorado?" We go to Colorado, we have a 100-year blizzard.
Oh,
And can't leave the hotel for 4 days. We're stuck in a hotel without a lot of food choices, and we played games, and we ended up enrolling the kids in school in Arizona during that time while we were in the blizzard. Fast forward, I go to Arizona, do a P&L job. It was a great opportunity. I then had an opportunity to do a lateral job, and I think lateral jobs are super important. I had an opportunity to go from the West Coast to the East Coast. It's about 3,000 miles, so quite a big move. But we had gone through a merger in 2000, and that merger brought together four very large businesses. I was part of the AirTouch business that was on the West Coast. The acquiring business was Bell Atlantic 9X, and they were on the East Coast. We had PCS Primeco and GTE in the middle. And each one of those businesses had a very different culture. The culture of the AirTouch Vodafone was, oh, they're kind of fruits and nuts from the West Coast. They like people, they're a people organization, but they really don't know data and financials and technology. And so recognizing that we had become Verizon in 2000 and that I really didn't know the key decision makers that were on the East Coast, I took a lateral job and I went from Arizona to the East Coast and I did another region president job. And I worked for a guy who sadly just passed away 2 weeks ago, but a guy who had such impact on my career because he was able to work with me, recognize that I did, in fact, have a lot to offer the business. And he sponsored my career as I then moved forward. I came back to the West Coast in a much bigger job 3 years later. And had an opportunity to be close to family once again. And then I did another move back to the Northeast to headquarters as the chief marketing officer role. I didn't know what I didn't know when I made those moves. I was just knew that leadership skills were transferable. I had a partner in my husband and with my kids that were going to support me in taking a chance and learning something new. And then I did the chief marketing officer role at headquarters for a couple of years. Then I was asked to go to the wireline business. Having grown up in wireless where the growth and the money was, nobody wanted to go to wireline. But our board said, hey, we need somebody who can demonstrate leadership skills moving from one business to the other. And I went a little bit kicking and screaming, a little bit of attitude. And it took me a couple of weeks to check my attitude at the door and realize that if I could embrace the people around me and learn, that it would be a great experience. And it turned out to be probably one of the most important developmental moves that I made in my career. So unplanned moves can be really impactful. One of the things I did, just because I think culture is so important, is having been the chief marketing officer, I had all kinds of branded things for wireless. And I ended up taking down most of those out of my office and went and got some old black and white pictures from the early days of telecom and put them around my office. And I did that intentionally because I needed to be accepted as one of them. I couldn't bring my attitude of superiority. I needed to say, I'm here to partner, I'm here to be one of you, and I'm here to learn and move the business forward. So I did wireline for a couple of years. I came back as the chief operating officer for Verizon Wireless, which was a tremendous opportunity to really pivot that business. And then my last 3 years at Verizon, I spent managing Verizon Business, which is a global business, serving customers in 150 countries around the world, employees in 60 countries. And what a tremendous opportunity to learn and grow in each one of those milestones. But as I reflected back as I was leaving Verizon, the thing that was most valuable and most important to me is it wasn't just the results that I could deliver, because I was known as somebody who could lead a team to deliver results. It was the way I left people feeling. Because as a leader, we have such an incredible opportunity. As individual contributors, we have that same opportunity to leave a positive impact on the people we work with, to be fair, to be clear about expectations, to recognize and celebrate, but also to be clear about developmental opportunities. So tremendous opportunity over that 35 years.
Tami, when did the role of CEO first come onto your radar?
Well, interesting. When I moved from customer service and made my first corporate move from Seattle to Arizona and had a chance to do a region president job, there was something about that job that was pretty liberating to me. It was one of 21 regions across the US. And we were very competitive in that space between the 21 leaders. And all of a sudden, the opportunity to be one of the top five region presidents, there's a theme here. I do like to win.
Yeah.
I always end with my teams go fight win because I believe that winning is the thing that we're set out to do, but to do it in the right way. So in that first region president job, I really kind of inched up my desire to be competitive. Then when I had a chance to go do an area president, and now I was managing five regions. And then I had a chance to go to headquarters, and you begin to see the people that are in those CEO roles, and you're like, I could do this. And so I think in the last 10 years of my career, I really began to recognize that I was able to, and learning every day and preparing for that next opportunity. And if I was more, as I reflect back on what would I do different, I might have been more intentional earlier on. And I think it's one of the things that as I reflect and learn and kind of advise people is you want to be focused on delivering today, but you also want to be building out your network and understanding what are the potentials inside your organization and outside your organization. And how do you build a network so that you can become a pivot player? You can move from one role to another, but you can be really intentional about the things that you say yes to and the things that you say no to.
There's so many things you've said along there that I'd love to pick up on. I mean, just, and we won't get to all of them, but just briefly, the advice about checking yourself and checking your attitude and being so intentional about how you went in and led that team and how critical that ended up being in your career path. The feedback that you were given around bringing people on the journey. I mean, you and I would both hear that with so many executives. You had another piece when you and I got together. I asked you a question around what feedback did you get in your career that you needed to hear along the way. And you shared with me someone had given you wonderful advice about not reverting to your old role under stress as you moved into the CEO. Tell us about that because that is such a huge challenge for female execs as they move up the ladder.
Yeah, I think it was really valuable feedback for me. I had a chance to, as I shared, be a region president in the Southwest. And then when I moved to the East Coast, be a region president in Washington, Baltimore. So I was good at that job. And then I had an opportunity to be promoted into an area president role. And when I went into that role, I had five regions that were reporting to me. And my boss at the time said to me, Tami, as you move into an area president role, we've intentionally asked you to move into this role. It has a different set of requirements, a different set of expectations. You're a different player on the team. And when you're under stress, when you're learning a new role, you're going to naturally want to go back to what you're good at. You're going to want to fall back into the role that you know how to do, that you've demonstrated success in two different geographies. You can't do that. You have to grow into the role that you've been given. And that was really important feedback for me because it turned out it's very true.
Yeah.
When you're under stress and pressure, you want to move back into a place of comfort. We all do that. But when you recognize that it's okay to be uncomfortable, that as you move into new roles, you're being tasked to spend time doing different things. One of the things that I've tried to do over the years is to really be clear about what role am I going to play in my role. What are the three or four or five things that I'm going to carry for the team and set the expectation of telling them where I'm going to focus my time and then measuring where I spend my time because I love people. So it's great to go in the field and spend time, and you have to do that. But if you've got shareholders you need to care for and a board you have to care for, and you've got partners that you're engaging with and customers you need to be talking to, it's very easy to be pulled in many, many different directions. And so his advice that said, you need to grow into the role you've been given. Don't slide back into the role you've come from just because it feels comfortable, really invaluable to me. And I've oftentimes used that coaching with others as you have a chance to move into new roles. The other thing I would just share with you, and we may or may not have talked about this, Melissa, but there's a book called The First 90 Days. It's a very simple, easy read. And I've read it every time I've taken on a new role because You jump from one role to another. You're saying goodbye to colleagues that you worked with. You really have to cut the cord and move into your new role. The first 90 days gives a great blueprint for how do you spend your time? What should you accomplish? How do you have permission to listen and observe before jumping into action, but not wait too long before you jump into action? How do you recognize that people are going to judge you the minute they see you and engage with you? How do you make sure you have a lasting impression and do it in the right way?
We did talk about that, and I interviewed Michael Watkins, the
Oh,
author.
did you?
Oh,
Oh, that's
it
awesome.
was a
That's
fantastic
awesome.
conversation, a great book and great advice. You touched there on being very clear about the things you were going to carry for the team. How did you, with such a huge business, complex, so many moving parts, how did you actually work out the critical issues that needed to be focused on?
Yeah. I had a boss one time who said to me, and he wasn't a boss that I particularly had a high degree of regard and respect for, but he said to me, I always start with what are the measures that I have to deliver? What are the numbers that I'm accountable for? And in his job, what's the revenue and what's the cost? And so, in my last role as the CEO for Verizon Business, we brought together the wireline business, the wireless business. We reoriented the business towards customer segments and away from wireless and wireline. And it went right back to my roots of how do we solve problems for customers in a digital transformation journey. But there were numbers that we knew every month, every quarter we had to deliver. And you'd have 91 days or 92 days in a quarter, and you had to start really early watching the points on the scoreboard so that you understood, am I making progress against the big numbers that matter? And so I think whether you like a boss or don't like a boss, you can always learn from people. And for me, that measure of what do I measure and how much time do I have to deliver on that? And what are the indicators that I'm progressing towards the outcome were really things that I tried to work with my teams on saying, and then I still do today in a board practice. What did we tell the street we were going to deliver? What did the management team say they were going to deliver? How did we deliver it? How did the analysts react and respond? So for me, the ability to be clear on how do we measure success, and then how do you bring people against a common goal and objective so everybody is clear. We have a number we have to deliver. We have a portfolio of numbers. And this dashboard concept of always watching the dashboard, which numbers are primary, which numbers are secondary, and then how do you unlock the power of culture and people against those targets so everybody has clarity? And then how do you at the individual level give people permission to stop doing things that don't matter so that everybody can focus on the things that do matter and make sure that they're ticked and tied?
I love that. It was going to be my next question was with a workforce of 75,000, how do you make sure people are aligned to go after those priorities?
Yeah. We have so many great technologies now that allow us to be very present with the people that are part of our team. And yet there's nothing quite like being in person with people. I did a lot of travel in my years at Verizon, particularly the last several years, even with COVID, trying to be present and being visible and being in front of and listening and observing and watching and engaging. And then there's nothing. Email is the only video game I've ever played. It's like whack-a-mole. Like, let me get rid of this email and this email. But when you're responsive, when people reach out, when you can be face to face, and then I did a lot of webcasts. How do you stand in front of your team and talk about priorities? How do you make sure that everybody has a common set of understanding? How do you do the kickoff? How do you do the mid-quarter? How do you calibrate? And be really open and transparent. And so whether it's email, whether it's picking up the phone, whether it's texting people, whether it's engaging on LinkedIn, making sure you have consistency in how you communicate, what you communicate, when you communicate. And then I'm a big believer, Melissa, in the power to celebrate people's milestones. So whether it's a 1-year anniversary of an employee or a 5-year anniversary, to make sure that you drop a note and get it out. Whether it's a promotion, one of the things that I consistently did with women who were promoted into director roles is I have these I won't be an advertisement for Glassy Baby, but there's a wonderful company out of Seattle, which is home for me, led by a woman who does these great candle holders, and they're all named, and one is Fearless. And every woman who was promoted into a director got a fearless note from me. And, so really finding ways to engage so that people feel like they're part of kind of the movement of what you're doing as a team. And I am a believer in servant leadership. When you are the boss, it is the most unimportant role. It is a role, but the most important role is unlocking the potential of the team against the mission. It is not about serving the boss.
Was there a moment in your career, and I love that story about sharing those candle holders, was there a moment in your career where the impact of you being a CEO and being female sort of struck you at all?
I think long before I was the CEO, I have had this focused attention on how do we really help women move forward in their careers. I don't remember the moment that started being important to me, but it has been important for 15 or 20 years. I've been very focused on how do we tap into and unlock the potential of women. I am a huge believer that tapping into the potential of women is not a women's issue. It is a leadership and an economic issue. And when I began to recognize, probably as far back as my customer service days, that women were not progressing as quickly as our male colleagues. And oftentimes it was because women didn't have the same flexibility from a home situation. We know statistically that women carry about 15 hours of home responsibilities that our male colleagues do not. So, very early in my career, I realized that we needed to level the playing field. It was when I was the chief operating officer for Verizon Wireless. I had a very distinct moment when we were celebrating our top performers. We happened to have been in Rome and we were doing what we call President's Cabinet and honoring and recognizing our top salespeople. And I had been several times throughout my career, but it was the first time I was hosting. And I was on the stage and it was the big recognition gala. And we were calling all of our winners up to the front. And we had asked their guests to sit at the very, very front and then our winners to come in when their names were called. And what I realized, it was a little bit like a dance. All the women were seated in the front seat as the guests, and all the men were being recognized.
Yeah.
And as I dug deeper into the data, what I recognized is 85% of our winners were men.
Yeah.
And it had never occurred to me until I visually saw it, till I sat there, stood there, and recognized that these were men we were celebrating. And it was a couple of things. Men have more confidence to say, I will put money at risk. Men have more flexibility in time in terms of how much time they can work in overtime. That's a problem with the program if overtime isn't managed, but okay, set that aside.
Yeah.
And I came back from that and created a program that has gone on to be a really important program within the business, Women of Wireless. And we put women into a 12-month program to say, how do we teach communication? How do we teach confidence? How do you define your personal brand so that women had an opportunity to say, of course I can compete for that competition because I'm willing to put compensation at risk, because when in a hunter-gatherer model, if you're the gatherer behind and doing the work, why wouldn't you take credit for that in having the confidence to lean in? And we know that if you give women a list of 10 skills that are required for a job, if they've got 9.5 of those, they'll be like, I'm not sure I'm qualified. Whereas men by nature will say, I got 5 or 6 of those. I'm sure I'm good for this job. And so it's really tapping into the vulnerabilities that we might have to recognize that those can be absolute strengths as we help one another on that journey.
That's a powerful visual that you talked about earlier.
Right?
Yeah,
Yeah.
a really powerful visual. I remember I had a different moment in my career, which was a really wonderful female leader who I kind of knew but didn't really know all that well, saying to me one day, because I had never actually stopped to process the impact of who people looked at from a leadership point of view. And she actually said to me one day, I don't think you have any idea how motivating and inspirational it is for us to see a female leading the organization. And
Mhm.
I'd never given it any thought before. Obviously, now I know a lot different, but
Right.
yeah, it's just one of those moments I look back. What surprised you about the CEO role? Like, if you think back to that role, was there something that surprised you about it?
Um, There were several things that surprised me about it, but I think one of the most important ones, and I like to share this with other people, is that it's not as complicated as it looks.
Yeah.
And when you're junior in your career, and I saw this throughout my career as at the CEO, and you engaged with others, first of all, people give you a lot of credit for the title. And there's a lot of respect that comes with the title and a lot of intimidation that comes with the title. And so learning to engage with people at every level of the organization as a human as opposed to as a title was a really important thing for me and really mattered to me in terms of how I did that. But as you got closer to the top of the organization, you realized there was no secret room where all the answers were held. You actually had to create those answers. And I think when you're junior in the organization, you're like, they got it. They must know the plan. I just haven't figured out what it is. And what surprised me as I moved into that role is there isn't a secret book where all the answers are. You actually have to come up with those answers and define them and build them and rally around them. And so if there was one surprise, it was there is no answer book waiting for you. And the other really big one was there's intimidation by title. And because I grew up within the organization, I felt like these were all my peeps. And I didn't really recognize that as I moved into different titles, there was a natural separation where people had this intimidation by title. And I had to work really hard to overcome that and to tap into the potential and the power of frontline employees, because I believe the power of our frontline employees unlocks the potential within an organization to deliver the brand. And so recognizing that there is intimidation by the title and really finding a way to reduce that friction and create commonality was also another important finding.
I love that heritage coming right through from the front line of the business because I think so many people miss the power and the strategy and
Yeah.
so many connections that come from that point. Tami, as a board director, what do you look for in CEO appointments? And beyond that, how do you know when a team's on track to deliver?
Yeah. It's been a really interesting transition for me as I've left day-to-day operating roles and gone into board management. There's it's a really important distinction. You're no longer the one operating the business. You're the one that is guiding the strategy and really holding governance and accountability for financial and strategic decision making and for talent at the CEO level. And I remember my very first public board was John Deere, and there couldn't have been a better first board. I mean, talk about a tremendous organization. But the responsibility to say, eyes on, fingers out, because you're not running the business, you're helping to govern that business. And it's been really rewarding to be able to. There is a great book called From Strength to Strength. And it talks about how in each of the phases of our lives, we have strengths that we bring to the business that we're engaged with, whether it's an operating business or a board role, and the ability to draw on the things, the experiences that I've had to really help guide as we think about are we measuring and monitoring and holding the management team accountable for what they said they were going to do? Because you do have responsibility to the shareholders to say, if we said we were going to do something, did we deliver that? And so that fiscal responsibility that comes with security and exchange and the audit process and the inspection process and the accountability is a really important balance as you think about the shareholder expecting the board to have accountability for working with the management team to make sure they do deliver. And yet so much of that does come back to who is the CEO and how do you think about the strategic placement of talent on the management team. And I've had the opportunity to work with new CEOs that have come into CEO roles. I've seen the opportunity of existing CEOs transitioning out as you go through succession. There are a couple of things that are so important as we think about kind of the CEO role. Number one is, what does the CEO role require today?
Yes.
And what does the CEO role require 3 years from now and 5 years from now? And so as we think about the responsibilities, are we clear with and are we as a board providing the potential and the capacity for the CEO to do the job that they've been tasked with doing? Are we investing in the development of the CEO so that the CEO continues to stay current? And are we holding the CEO accountable for the things that he said, he or she, more often than not, it's he, but he or she said they would actually deliver? And are we giving them the resources and the tools to do that? I think succession planning is oftentimes talked about, but not necessarily always executed effectively. And I have seen much more attention paid to succession planning over the last several years. And I think as we went through COVID, we saw a lot of change in leaders and a lot of change in what's required to successfully lead and manage a team in today's very global kind of uncertain environment that CEOs are operating in. And so I think having clarity of what do we need in each role? Do we have more than one candidate that could potentially do that role? Are we developing the talent that we think could potentially do that role? Are we looking internally and externally? So we're looking for people that understand the relevancy of the world in which we're operating today and the world in which we anticipate delivering in tomorrow. All of those have been important factors as we look at and evaluate the CEOs of today and the CEOs of tomorrow. The one thing that is common is having clarity of values. And I think that never changes. Integrity, respect, accountability, values that are important and essential to the business that they operate.
Amazing. You flagged then that more often than not it is a male. So why, I mean, I imagine a world where we don't have to have this conversation, but
Mhm.
why do you think there are not more female CEOs?
I think there are many women who don't believe they belong in the CEO role. And I think there are many boards that still today sadly believe that women do not belong in that role. And I think until you can see yourself in a role and imagine that you can do it, then you don't strive to actually do it. And it's the reason, Melissa, you and I have seen this in our own careers, why having a female CEO is really important because people want to believe that they can. And they also need to believe that it's not an exception that we sit in these roles. We celebrate every time a female goes into a CEO role, but why? Why shouldn't it be what happens as a normal course of business? And
Absolutely.
sadly, I think that there is this broken rung that I think happens to mid managers where they tend to fall out of their career and then as they continue to grow in the organization, there's fewer and fewer women. And so you have a lesser and lesser sense of belonging in the organization in which you're in. And so I think we are past the phase where women felt like they were competing with one another. And I think we've moved a lot further in our progress and understanding that we can lift each other up and we can support one another. And we have to have male colleagues that are bringing us along on this journey, just like we need to bring them along on the journey. I think we also know and have recognized that feminine leadership characteristics, caring, compassion, not to be confused with clarity and responsibility and accountability, can really are important leadership characteristics that this next generation of employees think are important, and we know are important. So I think you got to see yourself to believe that you can be there, to be able to dream that you can get there. Maybe I can share just one quick story. I have always looked up to Justice Day O'Connor, somebody who I admired from afar as I looked at her story. You know, her story is one of inspiration. She graduated top of her class from Stanford. When she graduated top of her class, she tried to get a job. And when she was trying to get a job, she talked to a number of law firms and they said, "No, sorry, we can't hire you. Sorry, we can't hire you." And she ultimately was offered a job. And there were two conditions for the job. Number one, she wouldn't get paid. And number two, she had to sit with the secretary pool. And I share that story because, by the way, she could have said no, and she could have said, "I'm not sitting with the secretary pool." By the way, they thought she belonged with the secretary pool because that's where women should be. But the fact is, she went on to become the first Supreme Court justice in the U.S. And I happened to be lucky enough to run into her one day. And she was on a plane. She was seated across the aisle from me. And so as we got into the air, I reached across the aisle and I said, "Justice Day O'Connor, I don't want to interrupt you, but I do want to thank you because I have the opportunity today to sit in the boardroom and I get paid. And she took my hand and she lovingly stroked it and she said, "Oh, honey, I'm so proud of you." And I
Oh,
oftentimes reflect on that moment, Melissa, because she didn't see herself there because there was nobody that looked like her
yeah.
there. She brought others along on the path with her, and she understood that her responsibility was to widen the path. And I oftentimes think about that for each of us as CEOs who have achieved that. Our responsibility is to widen the path, to make it easier, to remove the myths. And it's our responsibility to invite men to be part of that conversation, because when you only have 50% of the people playing on the field, you've left the other 50% on the field, and you can't afford to do that. And so when you bring people along, when you widen the path, we have the opportunity for more women to believe that they can belong there because they do belong there.
You made me teary when you shared that story. I can imagine that moment between the two of you. I do. I feel,
Yes, right?
yeah, that's incredible. You said something. So I've only got two more questions, right? Just to set the expectation for both you and our listeners. But the first one is, I really felt like you gave us a real insight into you as a leader when at the very start of this conversation you said, even with all of the things going on globally right now, and you and I both know there's a lot, we're still living at the best time and there's still so much opportunity. Just give us a minute or two on that. It just really struck me when you said that earlier.
Yeah. Listen, I think we're living in incredibly uncertain times, from a financial standpoint, from a geopolitical perspective, from a social perspective. And yet we live in a world where we have access to so many conveniences that are changing the way we live, work, and play. I was part of an industry and continue to be part of an industry that connected how we communicate. When I think about the communication capability that is changing how we think about healthcare and about education and how we think about relationships and the ability to, I'm seeing your picture of your family behind you, but I can pop pictures from my phone onto my mother's frame that is, 1,000 miles away, and she can see what I'm seeing today, and she doesn't have to know how to do it. We live in a time when just about anything is possible, but it's not possible for everybody today. And I believe that the separation that we have created between the have and the have-nots is a growing problem in the world in which we live. And let me just focus for a minute on kind of North America, and Australia certainly fits into this same criteria. We have democracy that allows us to have a set of rules about how we engage with one another that has served us so well for so long. I look around the globe where war ravages countries, and that's a whole separate set of challenges that my heart breaks when I look at how they're operating. And how do we get to a place where we have a common set of standards of everybody should have access to food? I live in the mountains at the western slope of Colorado, and I'm about 15 miles from Aspen, and I'm about 15 miles from Glenwood Springs. And there's tremendous abundance in Aspen. And in Glenwood Springs, 25 to 30% of kids go to bed hungry at night. There is no excuse for why that happens. And we as leaders have to take accountability and responsibility to take all the things that are good about the world in which we operate and find ways to expose and bring others along on that journey. And I just am so committed to that. And part of it is that, with age comes wisdom and a little more experience, and recognizing that we have to find a way technology is changing at a curve that we have never seen. The question is, how do we bring people along on that? How do we make sure people have access to healthcare and to education and to food? Some basic criteria. How do we allow people to have purpose in life and dream big? And it's those things that I think will ultimately be the legacy of what do we leave behind. It's not what career did you have, but what impact and how did you leave the world a better place. I grew up in a family where my father was a family practice physician, and I had the chance to work in his office for a number of summers. And this was very analog business. There were not medical records, although I had the opportunity to transform that office to their first kind of digital journey. But, I remember distinctly patients who would come in and he would mark NC across their chart, no charge.
Hmm.
Why? They didn't have insurance. They didn't have the financial. How do we as a community find a way to see where we need to bring others along, to give them the possibility and the potential that anything is possible and probable?
Tammy, my final question I ask everybody, what does brave feminine leadership mean to you? And do you think it needs to change?
There's always room for change in the world in which we operate, but I think brave feminine leadership is about having the courage to do what seems hard to do, having the courage to model what you expect and set the expectation that others show up on behalf of who we are as women. And brave leadership is about making sure that when people don't agree with you, you find the words to articulate why you believe differently and set an expectation that others can listen, but that you listen and learn so that you can bring others along on that journey. We live in a world that is difficult right now. It takes a lot of courage. I believe we must show up as fearless in the face of the challenges that face us, but we can only do that when we put on humanity first and recognize that everybody deserves the respect and dignity of being in the room for the conversation. And when we do the right thing when nobody is looking, it becomes part of who we are, and it shapes and influences the character of who we are. And when you do that, you demonstrate the kind of brave feminine leadership that's required to move the world forward.
Tami Erwin, thank you for joining our conversation. I've thoroughly loved the chance to talk with you.
Thank you. I've thoroughly enjoyed it as well. And I thank the listeners for being part of our conversation and engaging in really difficult conversations and making the world a better place.